So I'm here with Reg Leichty, who is the principal of Foresight Law and Policy here in Washington,
Yes.
D.C. I want to start, Reg, by asking about the current terrain with ESSA pushing down a lot of responsibility to states. And what's your assessment about states' readiness for this new challenge that faces them?
It's uneven. I think many states are still suffering from the effects of the 2008 recession and some of the budget cuts that were attendant at that time. I think some of the program consolidation in ESSA is actually compounding that, where some of the positions that have previously been funded with federal dollars associated with a particular program are now transitioning away. So I think this is an important moment for those states that don't have the capacity they need to reinvest. It's not easy to implement sophisticated accountability systems and monitor them and assessment systems. And you really do need, well-informed, high-quality professionals in those positions to make them work well. And in an environment that's now more state-facing, of course, that means that states have to assume more responsibility, I think, for building that capacity.
What in the current terrain is going to stop us from going back to that previous era?
Mm-hmm. I think that a lot of observers underestimate just how prescriptive the Title I accountability requirements are in ESSA. There's certainly a push back to states to be more locally kind of focused around their indicators, but at the same time there are these obligations around student performance that haven't gone away. I think the addition of the English language indicator is actually something that's, important also to recognize. And there's been a lot of conversation the last couple of weeks as Congress has stepped away from, the prior administration's accountability regulations and a kind of sense in some of the media that perhaps the system has almost been gutted. I don't think that's true. I think Title I is going to hold the line in important ways. Certainly states will have to make good decisions about the fifth indicator, and they'll have to be, I think, really responsible about how they're measuring progress year in and year out, but there is a backstop. And perhaps most important, I think, is what happens with those schools that are identified for improvement, because we have transitioned very dramatically away from the prescriptive models of the school improvement grant system that was authorized by No Child Left Behind. Now we're going to rely on a district needs assessment, which I think is good if well executed. And I think states need to be really strong partners with their districts in that work, because no matter how good the system of identifying those schools is, if we're not intervening in an effective way, it'll all be for naught. And that's where a lot of the flexibility in Title I, in my opinion, is built.
So is it the states who will decide what the interventions for those schools that are identified will be?
It's really incumbent on the districts.
Okay.
There's somewhat different treatment for the comprehensive support schools that are experiencing problems across the board, as opposed to the targeted support schools who might be missing the mark with regard to certain subgroups over time. But the statute's designed now to really put all of the decision-making about how to turn around those schools at the district level. States are called on to be partners in that work. And of course, a certain amount of the school improvement funding authorized by the new law is set aside for state action. So it's not as though the states aren't a partner. I think for state chiefs, state boards, they need to be pretty aggressive about how they use their state share. And that includes, using those additional resources as a way to make sure they're at the table with the district in deciding how to improve the schools that are just failing over time.
Okay. So what's the latest status of the education sciences reform?
So ESSA has been an on-again, off-again conversation on Capitol Hill the last 3 years, came very close to passing it at the end of the 113th Congress, and now 2 years later, we're still waiting for the bill to be completed. It was last updated when No Child Left Behind was approved, so it was a couple months after. So we've been waiting now 15 years. And of course, it's important because it authorizes all of the work that IES does in both research and data collection, but also programs like the State Longitudinal Data System program, which, going back to your question about accountability, is critically important. If those systems aren't working well, we don't have the transparency we need at the state level, and I think there's an opportunity to really build those systems better. It will be an uphill climb to get it through this Congress. I think it can get done. It's presently being held up in the House over concerns about data burden, student data privacy, some of the things that have become hot button issues in the states. I shouldn't say become, they've always been hot button issues, but maybe more pronounced the last couple of years. So we're hopeful that it'll move through the process between now and the midterm elections 2 years hence.
It really it's striking to me, and I've noticed this distinction in many different guises. But there's one perspective that says that that data privacy is a real concern, and then in professions there's the desire to use data to actually introduce improvement. So what do you see as sort of the key trade-offs between those two?
I think the balance between data use and privacy is probably more of a political challenge than a practical one. Truly. I think for policymakers that step back and look closely at the issue, there are clear ways to put administrative and technical safeguards in place to ensure that researchers can have access to the personally identifiable data they need in some cases for studies to be effective. I think states have done a pretty good job over the last 2 years as they've moved legislation at the state level that still allows educators to use data the way they need to use it day in and day out and provides opportunities for researchers to have access to data as well. We're in the middle of that same conversation at the federal level, and I won't say it's in a redundant way, but there is this chance to maybe make FERPA work a little better. Trying to codify some of the regulations that have, over the years, created better data sharing opportunities. The last two major regulatory changes were very good, but would also benefit from Congress's stamp of approval. Some people still need to be persuaded, though, that researchers should have access to this data, and there is a pretty intense conversation in the House about who the research benefits, interestingly. So one of the most significant FERPA bills introduced in the last Congress only allowed researchers to have access to PII if, in fact, you could show that the research would benefit the actual student whose data was being studied, which is an interesting twist. I think we'll get past that.
Researchers and policymakers have always had an uneasy relationship in the sense that there's been a divide between the communities, I would say, and a little bit of a distance between them. But at root, policy wants guidance, and researchers, I think, genuinely want to. Their profession is to contribute to knowledge and understanding in the world. What do you see as ways that we can bring these two closer together to be more useful to each other?
I think some of the divide has traditionally been, policymakers' distrust of maybe sophisticated studies that they don't always feel readily equipped to interpret. That's not always the case, but there's a sense, of course, among politicians that you can always find a study to make your point. And that might often be more of a statistical problem than kind of what the study itself looks like. But I think there needs to be a much better trust built between those two communities. And I think that has to begin with really an effective system for communicating what studies mean and don't mean.
You've been working with policymakers at all different levels of the system for a while now. What advice would you give to researchers who want to use their research to inform policy?
I think a couple things. One really being crystal clear about what policymakers are considering, at the time of your research. I think for most members of Congress, for state legislators, state board members who have to make important decisions, they have so much on their plate that they tend to be laser focused on the issues that are immediately in front of them. I think timing communications about important new research consistent with the policy decisions that have to be made at a given time is really important. That may seem simplistic, but sometimes really good ideas can come in and out of a policymaker's mind pretty quickly. I think second, don't rely on one conversation, right? I think you have, in any kind of engagement with a policymaker, you have to be, on the scene in an established relationship over time. These are complex issues. I think you have to build trust with the policymaker, about the work that's being done, about the individual who's delivering the message. And again, the timing's important. So you want to be there when a policymaker says, I have an important question about X or Y, and I had a conversation about that, I know, a year ago, but I need to refresh that. So I think you have to be persistent. And then lastly, I think you've got to be realistic about just what you can expect to be written into either law or regulation or even guidance.
The reason that we started the Knowledge Hub is really that we want to move research away from dissemination towards conversation.
Yeah.
So what you're saying, I think, is really important and valuable.
Good.
And I really appreciate you joining
My
us.
pleasure.
On Policy.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Great.